music, science. It's the Amoeba People Podcast.
Greetings and welcome to the Amoeba People Podcast, the show where science and music collide. Collide is a bit extreme, of course. It's really more like two old chaps crossing paths on a foggy bridge late at night, tipping their caps to one another. My name is Ray Hedgepeth. I am the singer-guitarist of the unconscionably nerdy science rock band, the Amoeba People. And today, you guys, we have got an entire episode about fossil hunting. We're going to begin by breaking down our song, The Ballad of Barnum Brown, from our latest album, The Fossil Record. And that song is about a guy who many believe to be the greatest fossil hunter of all time. Although, who knows? I mean, there's lots of fossil hunters, and maybe that's just a matter of opinion that we need to update. Who knows? Let's find out on this show. In addition to the song, though, I got to interview an incredible paleontologist. This guy, I can't wait for you to hear this interview with him. His name is Gabe Santos. He's the coolest guy. He's a paleontologist. He works at the Raymond ALF Museum of Paleontology in Claremont, California, where he's the collections manager and outreach coordinator. And this guy is just one of those amazing, dynamic individuals that you're just thrilled to even come across. Right now, as I'm recording this, I'm pretty sure he's in Mongolia, for example. Just throwing that out there. I believe he's out there with some paleontologists and some educators on a collaborative program. So he's that kind of guy. Plus, he runs this group called Cosplay for Science. You know, for a long time, the Amoeba People at our shows, we encourage people to come dressed up, either as a scientist or, sci-fi character, whatever they want to come dressed up as, really, because obviously we dress up on stage. And to hear that there's an organization out there, and an awesome one, by the way, with Gabe and his friends, where they go out and they go to different cons and they dress up and they talk science, and they talk the science behind pop culture or scientifically inspired cinema. So I can't wait for you to hear this interview and just hear the stuff that he is doing. It's going to be awesome. So before we get into that interview, let's hop right into the music. The Ballad of Barnum Brown is unique among the songs on the Fossil record because it began with the lyrics complete and no music. And we usually do things differently. Usually if there's a lyrical idea, there's usually some music to go with it, or if there's a musical idea, we start attaching words to it. They kind of come together at the same time, and then we build off of that. But this one was all words, all story, just the story of Barnum Brown and two of his most famous fossil hunting expeditions, and no real music to it. Although it did have a rhythm, it was written in ballad form. And suddenly I realized one day that it actually, here's a little guitar here to demonstrate, it actually did fit perfectly an old song that I loved by Marty Robbins called Big Iron. And I wondered if maybe subconsciously I had actually written it to that melody and wasn't aware of it, or if it was just a coincidence of the ballad form. Who knows? The mysteries of music, right? Anyway, let me play you real quick the Ballad of Barnum Brown, the first stanza here, to the melody of Big Iron, so you can see how it fits. 'Twas a cold December morning back in 1898. A brave young fossil hunter was a-pondering his fate when he heard there was a ship that was about to leave the dock. There was room for him if he could somehow beat the clock. Somehow beat the clock. Love that old song, Big Iron. But that's Barnum Brown lyrics to the melody of Big Iron. So I realized to get away from that, because once I realized that those matched, I couldn't extract those words from that melody. So I went from a very direct major chord to something dramatic and minor. And for some reason, F minor just kind of popped out. And then this chord, a B flat natural. Then all of a sudden I was like, hey, now we're in a spaghetti western. And with that came a little bit of a melody, and pretty soon we were on our way. 'Twas a cold December morning back in 1898. A brave young fossil hunter was a-pondering his fate when he heard there was a ship that was about to leave the dock. There was room for him if he could somehow beat the clock. Oh, Oh, Barnum Brown. So now we're on our way. We've got our own melody. It's very spaghetti westernish. So now I'm going to bring in the actual tracks and show you how we went from a big iron-esque ballad to a spaghetti western style ballad. So the first obvious change there is that the tempo has increased dramatically, and that's because if you're going to bring in Dustin Jordan, drummer of the Amoeba People, you really want to give him something to sink his teeth into. So increasing the tempo, which means I have to sing a little faster, is small sacrifice when you get drums like this. Okay, now let's bring in some bass to fill in the low-end frequencies and an electric tremolo guitar. This is played on a Fender Telecaster, and it seems to be a staple of just about any spaghetti western composition. Okay, now almost all the elements are in place, but now we've got to bring in the trumpets, the all-important trumpets in your spaghetti western composition about a fossil hunter from the late 1800s and early 1900s. I know, somehow it makes sense. So at least in the Amoeba People universe, it makes sense. So we brought in our friend Paul Justice, the amazing Paul Justice, who you've probably heard in a previous episode, the Volcano episode. He played the trumpets on that song, and he came in and laid down the trumpets for Barnum Brown as well. Okay, now one final track I want to play for you before we transition to my interview with Gabe Santos, and that is the whistle at the end of the song. Basically, I guess it's supposed to convey, maybe Barnum Brown, similar to a spaghetti western. He's walking off into the sunset, but, he's walking off with fossil finds, or he's maybe walking back to the museum that sent him to go find these fossils. Whatever it is, this whistle idea, of course, is a common motif in spaghetti westerns as well. And so Ryan Mosley, our bass player, it turns out, is an incredible whistler. So I gave him this part. I said, hey, let's throw this in at the end. And he kept asking me, are you sure those notes are right? Because the interval was very odd. And I knew it was odd. And I kept telling him, I know it's strange. And he's like, maybe I can try this, maybe I can try. But for some reason, I kept pushing for this particular interval from the root chord, and it wasn't until after we recorded the song and put out the album that I realized it was stolen from a Bjork song, her song Isobel, and just the interval is stolen, and it's also a whistled part. But hey, what do you know, Marty Robbins and Bjork influences on the Amoeba People. Here it is. Man, I wish I could whistle like that. Okay, so we're going to put all of the tracks together at the end of this episode and hear the completed version of the Ballad of Barnum Brown from the Fossil Record at the end of this episode. And that comes after our interview with the incredible Gabe Santos of the ALF Museum in Claremont, California. But before we get to that interview, here's a word from our sponsor.
Has your loved one recently kicked the bucket, gone tails up, joined the choir invisible, here at the Barnum Brown Family Fossil and Funeral Home? we can ensure your loved one's remains are fully fossilized, ready to be dug up by future paleontologists in a mere 10,000 years. Our specialists know just how and where to bury your loved one so that the natural fossilization process can occur. And for a nominal fee, we can include a non-erodable placard with your loved one's information, so that when they are discovered by paleontologists 10,000 years in the future, they can be placed immediately in the nearest Natural History Museum, without all that fussy scientific debate over the fossil's origins. Call the Barnum Brown Family Fossil and Funeral Home for a quote today. Barnum Brown Family Fossil and Funeral Home, ensuring your loved one's posterity into the future, way into the future.
I drove out to the Raymond ALF Museum of Paleontology in Claremont, California on a 100-degree day, no joke. But by the time I made it out there, the heat actually wasn't so bad. The museum is on the campus of the Webb Schools, and it's set in these hills with trees and this beautiful setting. And I got there, I was like, wow, I hardly even noticed the heat, even though it was 100 degrees. And maybe also, too, it had something to do with the company that I was with that day. The people of the ALF Museum are just incredible. They're so helpful. They want you to learn stuff. They want to show you everything. They want people to learn about paleontology. I mean, the Webb schools literally have high school students working alongside paleontologists. I mean, what a brilliant concept. I mean, if you ever needed to know, is paleontology for me or not? Well, guess what? Working alongside a paleontologist is going to answer that question for you. And so the inspiring nature of this place just overwhelmed me. So the moment I got there, the collections manager and our guest today, Gabe Santos, greeted me and took me on a tour of the place. And then we found our way down to one of the classrooms that was not being used, with just, scientific equipment everywhere and fossils and all sorts of things. And we sat down in there, and that's where I conducted this interview with him. So I am thrilled to share with you guys my interview with the incredible paleontologist Gabe Santos. So, let's go fossil hunting. One of the many things that immediately impressed me about the Raymond ALF Museum was their mission statement. It's not just about paleontology, it's also about getting the public to think critically and scientifically in any given situation. So I started off by asking Gabe to elaborate a bit on that.
Our goal is to get people to appreciate science through paleontology. So no matter what job they go into the future, no matter what they're doing, because they experience science firsthand through paleontology at the museum, they can go out and appreciate science in their everyday lives and understand the importance of science, no matter what job they do in the future. A lot of what we do in the museum, but a lot of what I do as an educator, whether I'm doing it online or like with Cosplay for Science, our goal is to get people to understand understand how to think critically and ask the right questions. And it can apply to whatever they're doing, right? And the way we kind of talk about it in our group is like, it's about finding the way for them to relate to those concepts, right? So there's like this whole thing that's popular right now about science narrative, utilizing narrative to tell science or to teach science, right? But if you look back, most cultures are narrative based. Our entire history is a narrative. So if that's what it is, it's about getting that proper narrative so that people can relate to it and understand it all the time. Yeah, even in paleontology, we like to think of the first paleontologists, right? We're like Barnum Brown, Cope and Marsh, or Mary Anning, right? Those were the first people who applied science narratives to things. But if you look at like ancient myths, a lot of those are explanations for the first fossils that were found, right? The Cyclops of Greek mythology, we now think that it was because ancient Greeks found mastodon fossils, these giant looking animals. But if you lay out a mastodon on its back or whatever, it looks like a giant human, and its skull has that big hole in the front for its trunk. But if you're an ancient human without much understanding of comparative anatomy, you see that and you're like, oh, that's probably where the giant eye went, and that's where you get a cyclops.
Of course.
In Nordic mythology, right? After huge storms, people would go out onto the beach cliffs and find fossils of echinoderms, these big round stones. But for them, because after a thunderstorm hit, they called them thunderstones because they believe Thor would throw down lightning, and at the end of each lightning tip was these stones that had like the star in the front because of the echinoderm, but it's their the type of symmetry they have. And so that's what their explanation was. And then they only showed up after a storm because the storm eroded them out the cliffs.
Right.
But to them, they thought Thor was literally hurling thunderbolts at them.
Of course, why would they not?
Yeah, and so like all of these ancient myths, these old narratives to tell explanations of fossils, people don't realize it's like that's kind of like the first paleontology.
I mean, this is just gold for somebody like me. You know, I had heard that, you know, ancient people probably got the dragon myth from dinosaur fossils that were found, but I did not know that the Cyclops myth most likely comes from a mastodon fossil. I mean, this is just, that's why I love doing this podcast. So, you know, the information is interesting, but of course the people giving you this information are endlessly fascinating. So I wanted to know a bit about Gabe's background and how he got into paleontology in the first place.
So my story is kind of unique or just different than most paleontologists. Growing up, I love paleontology. I grew up in LA basically, so I had the Naturalist Museum. I had the tar pits all the time to go to. And so like most kids, I love dinosaurs. But I really wasn't considering paleontology as a career position until much later. For me, like in my family and my culture, paleontology is just not a thing. So I was originally going to medicine. I got my undergraduate degree in biological sciences. And after all that, I just wasn't happy with where my career was going. Like, you know, my passion is storytelling and stuff. So it just wasn't a right fit for me. And so after going through that and some other personal stuff, I shifted careers over. And so I decided not to be a doctor. And so I was kind of doing whatever for a little bit. And then my parents took me on a trip to New York for my birthday. And so I started walking through the halls of the American Museum of Natural History.
So great.
And when you're there, you know, you see the giant Paraceratherium, which is like their giant rhino that they have. And I stood under there and I was like, for a long time. And I'm like, wow, someone had to figure out what that was. Someone had to like describe it, put it together and tell its story. And I was like, that's what I want to do.
That's so cool that, you know, when most of us see that, like myself included, you know, there's the sense of awe and the sense of what is this? But I find it interesting that your mind went to, okay, who did this? How'd they do it? How did they figure out where it fits in the big picture? So is that something that has always kind of just been with you, like wanting to figure out how things work behind the scenes?
Oh, totally. Like my mom will tell you, like she'd come home and find like insects in our freezer or whatever. Cause I was like, I asked as a kid, you know, I have questions and I'm like, what happens if you freeze an insect? Or like, you know, she got mad because I pulled apart like one of my cameras she bought me when I was a kid because I wanted to see what was inside. So I've always had questions about the world and how things worked. And so for me, that's all. And then like, I think again, it comes back to my love of storytelling. Like you see something, you want to figure out how it works. And then I want to tell people about it. So I'm always like, my cousins will tell you like when we were kids, they'd always be like, oh, here goes Skuya again saying these words or whatever, or like telling us the same thing about dinosaurs or whatever new science fact I found.
What was the nickname there?
Oh, Kuya, that means eldest in Filipino.
Oh, okay. You see what I mean? Endlessly fascinating. In fact, I'd say the people who find these fossils and categorize them are as fascinating, if not more fascinating than the fossils they find. And since this is an episode about fossil hunting, let's get into it. Let's figure out how it's done. How do we start? Where do we find fossils in the first place?
So most fossils are discovered kind of, I guess, by accident. Or not really accident. It's like, as paleontologists now, we know where we can find fossils because, you know, there are only certain types of rocks where you can find fossils. So what paleontologists will do is they'll go to an area where we know that there's been fossils, and then what we'll do is prospecting. And prospecting is kind of walking on the ground, looking for any evidence of fossil fragments, and then if we find something, we can trace it back to its source and kind of excavate from there. And then, on the other hand, a lot of times it is by accident. Someone's hiking, like, down in Orange County in one of the canyons, and then after a rainstorm, a whale skull is partially eroded out. And then you find a fossil that way. People are walking through the desert, and then they find part of a vertebra exposed. So sometimes it is by chance. The Kaparowitz Formation, where we work now in Utah, that was actually also kind of by accident. One of our students at the time, Jeff Kripe, they were out there already looking for fossils, and he discovered a fossil at one of the cliff sides. I think it might have been part of a tyrannosaurid. And so after finding that, Andy and them realized there was a whole quarry. There was like a huge bone bed there. And so they've been working it for like 10 years now, I think, finding so many amazing fossils out of there.
Okay, so I didn't know if there was an answer to this question, but I was curious. I mean, what is the oldest fossil found? Or maybe better yet, when were the first fossils found that we know of? Can we know how far back that happened?
People have been finding fossils as long as we've been able to dig in the ground, right? So a lot of people say like the dragon origin, right? Like the myth of dragons was because people were finding dinosaur fossils, these giant lizard skeletons, and they didn't know what they were. They're extinct, so they're just trying to tell a story.
Right.
Some of the first times people found fossils and were actually thinking about them critically as a scientist or a naturalist, you've got obviously people like Mary Anning. You've got Cope and Marsh during the Bone Wars, trying to find those fossils.
Okay, a quick aside about Cope and Marsh. Now, when I first heard Cope and Marsh together, I thought it was one fossil hunter, Cope and Marsh. I thought Cope was the first name and Marsh was the last name. Yeah, I'll admit it. I'm okay to admit that. It turns out those are two guys. Cope was one, Marsh was the other, and they were involved in something that has now become known as the Bone Wars. Now, this would be pre-Barnum Brown, if I remember correctly. But this is when people really began finding, dinosaur fossils everywhere. And these guys were cutthroat with each other. It started off, I guess, as a friendship, and then it became a friendly competition, and pretty soon they were enemies, and they were sabotaging each other's dig sites. Someday soon, I hope to do an entire episode on the Bone Wars. And of course, we don't have a song about the Bone Wars. Not yet, that is. It would have been perfect for the fossil record. But hey, there's always more material to write about. Anyway, so just real quick, these guys, their names were Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope. I mean, if that's not the ingredients for a great epic battle in the making, or a great epic Amoeba People song, I don't know what is.
The golden age of paleontology, as they say, is like in the early 1900s. And those were when people were actually starting to think about these extinct creatures and trying to figure them out. Like, there's even the story of Thomas Jefferson, right? He was fascinated by fossils. And so one of his goals going out into the West was to try to find mastodon fossils, right? Or even ground sloths. It's obviously not the only reason he went west.
Right.
There's a lot of really bad reasons he went west, but that is one of the things that drove him was paleontology and the trying to answer these questions of these animals we know nothing about.
So fantastic. So I realized I was getting carried away with this line of questioning, and I needed to go kind of back to the simplest question, which is, what is a fossil? Like, fossil hunting is great, but let's make sure we understand what we're actually looking for.
So here at the museum, whenever I give my little tours to our second graders, we always say fossils are any evidence of past life.
Okay.
So it could be obviously skeletal elements, bones. Sometimes they're footprints. They're impressions left behind. They could be things like the shells of an animal. They can even be like poop, fossilized coprolites.
Which we have an entire episode about if you want to go back and listen to episode 1 of this podcast, Coprolites with Tony Fiorillo. Okay, back to Gabe Santos.
So any evidence of extinct animals from long ago, we consider it a fossil because we use those as evidence of past life to reconstruct the past. How a fossil forms, generally, again, it's depending on what type of fossil we're looking at. But for bone fossils, that's because the bones are mineralized. The organic portions are replaced and petrified. They're turned to stone or replaced by stone. And so that happens over a very long period of time. What's got to happen is an animal dies, obviously. And then most of the time they're buried really quickly in some kind of sediment, mud, sand, dirt, whatever. And over time, as they continue to get buried deeper and deeper, the pressure and heat and time and water and all that starts to replace the organic material with the minerals around it. And then what's left behind is kind of a copy, a copy in stone.
It's almost like the bone becomes like a mold for the minerals to kind of follow and take shape in.
Basically.
Wow.
And so all of that is what's left behind, and that's what we're finding today. We're not finding organic bone, we're finding the mineralized versions of them. Right. Unless we're like working in the Pleistocene, and then sometimes those things aren't fully fossilized, and I don't really like working with Pleistocene fossils. They're very delicate.
Too soon?
Yeah,
too soon.
Too soon. They break so easily, and it gives me anxiety.
Oh gosh, yeah. Fossil anxiety sounds horrible.
Oh yeah, working in collections it's a good level of anxiety. Because like you're always worried about breaking a fossil. Because I mean, my whole job as a collections manager is to ensure these fossils last for a long time, but people got to handle them sometimes.
Right.
Here at the museum, our students are our researchers, so I have like 15 researchers looking at fossils at any time.
Right.
And we have volunteers and stuff, so there's any place where a fossil could break, even if we're doing our best to make sure it doesn't break. Sometimes fossils are just delicate no matter what. So you've been doing your best, and sometimes it'll just break. I remember one time I was working on a fossil, and I breathed a little too hard, and something chipped off, and I was like, really? You're not an official paleontologist until you break a fossil. So that's how we joke around with people.
It reminds me of when I was learning guitar, and like all my friends were learning guitar. We were teenagers, and we're like, yeah, like you break your first string, then you're like a real guitar player when you break your first string. And your friend's like, oh, how'd you break your first string? It's like a rite of passage, And you're like, I was shredding, or I was like learning some Jimmy Page part, but really you were probably just tuning it, and you tuned it too high and it snapped, but you want to make everybody think you were like learning some amazing riff. Yeah. So see, guitars and paleontology, so similar. Next, I asked Gabe about the hobbyists, the people who bring in fossils to the museum, and they're like, hey, like, what is this? Or how much is this worth? Or like, how often does that happen? Is that a frequent occurrence? I mean, are people finding things all the time?
We get people coming to the museum to bring us fossils all the time for identification.
Really?
We have a line. We love doing it because these are people who are passionate about finding something for the most part. And so we love to help them learn. A lot of the times, unfortunately, they're disappointed because they're bringing in stuff that aren't fossils. They're bringing in concretions that they say is a dinosaur egg they found in their backyard. And it's like, unfortunately, the area you live in, there's no dinosaur fossils. It's not the right age. But then we can also turn around and be like, but it's a cool concretion. Look, let's talk about geology. A lot of times there are people who come and are just so convinced that they get kind of mad at us that we tell them it's not a fossil. Every now and then we get people who get really mad and like, oh, you just want to keep it for yourself or blah, blah, blah. And we're like, I mean, we don't really want your rock.
So they think you're like kind of downplaying like how amazing their find is, because secretly in your mind you're like, oh, I want to get that thing into this collection.
And like, I don't understand that because I don't see why.
You guys have all these amazing fossils already, but they've got this one thing that they're convinced that is going to make them famous or something.
Yeah, and as paleontologists or as educators here at our museum, at least, if they truly found something worthwhile, we would want to share it with them. We'd want them to understand the importance of the thing that they found. We want people, if people truly found something legally too, that's a whole nother topic.
Yeah, because there's only certain places where you can legally look, right?
Yeah, here in California, you have to have a permit to collect vertebrate specimens, and there's very few places to collect. And then anyway, fossil collecting with the amateur avocational community, there's a line that we have to tread carefully, because we want people to be passionate about finding specimens and finding fossils. And there are most avocational amateur paleontologists are amazing to work with. They want to set up connections and work with scientists, and that's what we want. And then, so it's a fine line that we walk to ensure that the best interests of both are kept in mind. Then you've got commercial paleontology, where people will collect and sell. That is a very fine line as well. I myself, I'm not anti-selling of fossils, but I am more advocating to understand the importance of some things.
Yeah.
You know, there are some people who will find something, an important fossil, and will just sell it on eBay and just try to make the most money off of it and not understand its scientific importance.
Right.
Sometimes when people come to the museum, they ask us, well, how much is this worth? And then we'll be like...
You're like, this isn't Antiques Roadshow.
No. And we try to explain to them in the way that, we're not telling them it was bad to think that. There's a culture behind it. Mm-hmm. So we'll say stuff like, well, fossils are priceless. Each one is an important piece of data or important story to tell in history. And so that's why it doesn't have a price, because it's irreplaceable. Mm-hmm. And
they're like, aha, I figured you'd say that.
Yeah, I mean, there are people right. People who will they want to know how much it costs, but we won't tell them that, because fossils are irreplaceable. Mm-hmm. They're priceless to us. Mm-hmm. If they want to find someone to price it, I'm sure they can go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. But we try to advocate and educate on their scientific importance, their historical importance, and even for some people, the cultural importance of fossils.
Yeah.
There's a lot of poaching in the world, fossil poaching. People will go to other countries and take fossils and bring it home illegally and try to sell it for monetary gain, but they remove an important piece of culture for other parts of the world because that's their shared history. Right now, actually, at the museum, we're hosting Mongolian exchange students from Mongolia with with one of their advisors, who's also an amazing paleontologist, Dr. Balorsa Sigminjin. Mm-hmm. She is a paleontologist from Mongolia. She studied here in the United States, but she started this thing called the Institute for the Study of Mongolian Dinosaurs. Mm-hmm. And what it is she wants to educate people in Mongolia about the importance of paleontology, because for the longest time, foreigners have come in and poached fossils or taken fossils out illegally. And the Mongolian people, for a lot of them who live in the Gobi, they just didn't understand what the significance was. Mm-hmm. They saw an opportunity to make money. Right. And they're just trying to feed their family. Mm-hmm. So there's no real blame on them because they didn't know better. Mm-hmm. And what Bolor is doing now is going through the Gobi on this amazing mobile museum and teaching people the importance of paleontology, so that now they don't see it as a way to make money. They see as something to be preserved, something to have ownership over as a people of Mongolia. Mm-hmm. And so she's doing amazing work to mitigate a lot of that. And she's also helping to repatriate a lot of stolen fossils back to Mongolia.
And cool thing is, you might have heard me mention earlier in this episode that Gabe was in Mongolia while I was recording this. And while he was there, he was working with the ISMD, the Institute for the Study of Mongolian Dinosaurs, which he just mentioned. And he'll be returning to the U.S., of course, to continue his work with the Raymond ALF Museum as collections manager and outreach coordinator, educating the public, getting people to think critically about their world, but also to understand paleontology more deeply. And of course, he will be continuing his work with Cosplay for Science, this incredible organization that he co-founded. I was just thrilled to have him on this episode today. So this is just a quick thank you to Gabe. Thank you so much for your passion and for teaching everybody, including myself, so much about your passion. And so I asked him, I said, hey, will you introduce the Ballad of Barnum Brown for us? And he was actually very excited to do so, which just thrilled me to no end. So without further ado, thanks to Gabe, and here is his awesome introduction.
Hi, I'm Gabe Santos. I'm the collections manager and outreach coordinator of the ALF Museum in Claremont, California, and the co-founder of the Cosplay for Science initiative. And this is the Ballad of Barnum Brown by the Amoeba People.
December morning back in 1898. A brave young fossil hunter was a-pondering his fate when he heard there was a ship that was about to leave the dock. There was room for him if he could somehow beat the clock. Oh, Barnum Brown, A scientific expedition was about to raise its sail, and this young fossil hunter knew he couldn't drag his tail. It was bound for Patagonia, a place without renown, but the fossils that were rumored seemed to call to Barnum Brown. Ooh, Barnum Brown. Patagonia proved brutal and his spirits quickly fell, and the outcome of the journey not a single soul could tell. The digs were hard, there seemed to be no fossils to be found, but Barnum was convinced somewhere they'd find that hallowed ground. Ooh, Barnum Brown. He felt if he could take a boat just up the coast a bit, he'd find those fossils with determination and some grit. The others in the expedition countered with a scoff, yet be a fool to sail away alone and venture off. Ooh, Barnum Brown. Early that next morning, Barnum struck out on his own, but his tiny boat soon crashed and he was weary and alone. Somehow he made it through and found his way back to his mates. They were not too pleased that he had tampered with the fates. Ooh, Barnum Brown. They called to him across the waves and helped him to the shore, and found that in his boat he carried fossils by the score. A bold and daring lad he was, which soon brought him renown, and soon all fossil hunters knew the name of Barnum Brown. Ooh, Barnum Brown. It was only 2 years later that he blew everyone's minds. The world by then was quite abuzz with ancient fossil finds. In the Badlands of Montana lurked a hidden fossil trove, buried like a treasure deep within a pirate's cove. Ooh, Barnum Brown. Barnum wiped his brow as his crew looked on in shock. They found a frightful skeleton embedded in the rock. Its massive teeth and giant head were fearful to behold. Barnum felt a shiver as the wind blew hard and cold. Ooh, Barnum Brown. He lifted up a knife-like tooth and held it in his hand. To think this deadly creature once had roamed across the land. In ancient time this monster terrorized its helpless prey, but his fossils were the only thing that Barnum found that day. Ooh, Barnum Brown. Its name became synonymous with nature pure and raw. Tyrannosaurus Rex, the name that still inspires awe. But there's another name that deserves its own renown. The greatest of all fossil hunters, that was Barnum Brown. Ooh, Barnum Brown. Ooh, Barnum Brown. Barnum Brown.
Thank you for listening to the Amoeba People podcast. If you like this show and want to help support it, the best thing you can do is write us a review in iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you download podcasts. Those reviews really, really mean a lot, and that's how other people find out about it. You can also help support us by contributing to our Patreon page financially. People have already done that. I know it's blowing me away. So thank you, people, for supporting our podcast monetarily and also with the reviews you've been writing. It's working, and we're thrilled that other people are finding out about our show. I also want to thank the Raymond ALF Museum of Paleontology. Oh my God, they are so incredible. You got to get out there. The entire staff is wonderful. They're super helpful, and they love fossils. They love science, and they want you to learn more about it too. So get out to the Raymond ALF Museum in Claremont, California. I'd also like to thank Paul Justice, the trumpet player on the Ballad of Barnum Brown. He's a good friend, an incredible musician, and he has a YouTube page called Trumpet Dude, where he plays vintage trumpets, old jazz standards with vintage trumpets in a garage. It's so lo-fi. It's my favorite YouTube channel of all time. He also has a band called the Paul Justice 4 out there in Boise, Idaho. Check him out if you're in town. Until next time, everyone, onward!